Webinars are an entitlement that you have as a customer of the AdvantageNFP products, so Fundraiser, Box Office, or CRM. And you will be able to view the back catalogue of all of our webinar content by subscribing, if you don't already subscribe, to our Advantage NFP newsletter. You can do that by going to AdvantageFundraiser.com or AdvantageNFP.com. Either of those two sites, you can sign up for the newsletter. You can also then monthly in our newsletter, you'll receive the information to be able to access the backlog catalogue of webinar material. They're a really good resource. There's 80 plus webinars recorded there covering a wide range of topics, and strongly encourage you to do that. Today's webinar is on the topic of best practice. Quite interesting, I think. Hopefully this will be quite an interactive session. We are recording today's session. We're doing that obviously to make it part of the catalogue. And just a little reminder, the recording includes the chat window as well. But we strongly encourage you to ask questions today as we're going along. And really, if you have best practice that you would like to share as well with the other audience members, that would be fantastic. We've got a few ideas of things that we thought would be relevant to try and show you, or at least discuss today. So let's move on with the session. So just a reminder, we say this on all of our webinars, that we're really happy for you to share the content of the webinar with your colleagues. No problem at all, but we ask that you don't share it outside of the organisation without confirming with us first. Normally at this point, I say we have a question and answer session at the end. I can break with tradition today and say, let's have the question and answers as we go along. You can raise questions by doing one or two things. You can pop your hand up, so raise your hand within Teams, and Jane or I will notice that, and we'll come to you for that question. If we miss you, please just unmute and shout out so we know, but obviously we don't want a free-for-all, so we'll try and moderate that as best as we can. Or if you prefer, you can type questions into the chat window as well, and we'll pick those up from the chat window. If we're lucky, we'll get a little bit of time at the end just to recap on anything that wasn't clear, but I've ambitiously put a lot of content into this half hour. We're going to move fairly quickly through it, and we'll see where we get to. So rabbiting on here, for those of you who don't know who I am, Steve Cast, I'm the founder of AdvantageNFP. We were formed back in 2001, and we are responsible for a number of products. I think pretty much everybody on the call today is an AdvantageNFP Fundraiser customer. So Fundraiser is our integrated fundraising membership and alumni database. We also have our AdvantageNFP Box Office solution for ticketed event management, and that's really for fundraising organisations with venues. So for example, if you have an attached theatre or conference facility that you book out, and we also have AdvantageNFP CRM as well, which is our CRM product. The content that I'm going to run through today, and I'm going to do that through live demonstration, this is standard functionality. Pretty much, or mostly, as I say, they're available to all customers. There's a slide at the end where I talk a little bit about plugins, and those plugins do come at additional cost. However, I'll make it absolutely clear as we're going through the content what you can do with the standard product and what is available with an additional feature for you. In terms of the content, so the topics we want to try and cover, I want to talk about the recording of all communications. We want to talk about how to manage and process deceased supporters. We want to talk about our activity setup, opting in and opting out versus legitimate interest. So when to use one or other, or potentially both. Talking about tax reclamation and the checks that you should do, or we encourage you to do before you do a tax reclaim. So that's gift aid. Talk a little bit about tasks and staff. Tasks is a really powerful feature, but does require a little bit of setup first, and just to recap on how to do that setup. We'll also try and talk about the need for editing contact details, the benefits of doing data cleaning, so how you might go about doing that. Some conventions around filter naming, around your password policy, and also around the remote link capability for those of you that are using the public cloud function. And then we'll close briefly with comments around use of SharePoint, PAF or post office address files, so lookups, address lookups, and so on. We'll talk about MailChimp integration and the Outlook add-in integration as well. So quite a lot to cover. If there's anything else that you think, oh, I really wish they'd cover that topic in the best practice, do feel free to pop that in the chat window, and we'll come to that as we can. So let me just share my screen with you all. And we'll jump to Advantage Fundraiser. And if you just bear with me just for 2 seconds, just to have that PowerPoint open as well. So I've got that in front of me on the other side. Okay. So one of the first topics to talk about is recording all communications. So when you're in Advantage Fundraiser, we think it's a really good idea to record communications that you have with supporters. So, for example, if we go to search for a record within the database, so we're on the phone with a particular supporter, let's say that is Stephen Cast that we're speaking to. We search for that supporter. When we click on the highlight record here, we see information at the bottom of the screen. And one of the things we see in the summary is the date of the last incoming communication and the date of the last outbound communication. So what are we talking about with communications? That could be letters, it could be emails, it could be telephone calls and so on that you've had with that supporter. How do you access those? Through the communications folder and communications here. So one of the things that we recommend is if you're emailing supporters, that you log the details of those emails within Advantage. We very clearly recommend for best practice that if you're generating thank you letters or correspondence, invitations to events, those kind of things, that you make sure that those are recorded within Advantage. The good news is if they are generated by Advantage, so if they are mail merged letters, for example, or mail merged emails, then it will automatically give you the option to record those communications within Advantage. But it's really good practice to do that. So, for example, if I wanted to record a telephone call that I'm having today with this supporter, I go into the communications folder and new, and up here I have some functionality that allows me to record details of that communication. Couple of top tips. If you don't know, anything with a yellow background indicates that that is mandatory information. So before recording a communication, I must say who the communication is with, so the supporter in this case, or the party. I must also say the date and time of the communication, and I need to indicate whether it was incoming or outgoing. Normally, when you're logged in, the staff member will be filled in for you. We're coming to that in a second. So I'm going to say that for today, I am Sally Hanson, and it is Sally that is communicating with Steve. It was an outgoing telephone call, and I would be putting information in here about the detail about the telephone call. If I want to expand that information, I can click on the Notes tab here and I can put more information in. And I can also timestamp the date and time of the note that I made in that communication as well. Though generally with the communication, you don't need the timestamp because obviously you've put the date and the time in at the top there. So really useful mechanism of recording a communication. If we do that, we start seeing in this folder the transaction history, the communication history that we have with that supporter. We can obviously look as well at their fundraising history, so we can get an indication of when we communicate and when we're receiving donations from that supporter. So really straightforward process to do, and we'll obviously record those communications really quickly for us in the system. Any questions at all about recording communications or good practice on communications? Jane, I might rely on you to tell me if anyone has their hand up, by the way, because I can't see that screen at the minute. Okay, so we'll move on then to talking about deceased supporters. Okay, so if we have a supporter that is, sadly, we've been notified that they've been deceased, we would obviously search for them within the database, and we need to update their record to say that they are deceased. Now, little best tips, when we go into work with the record, we would typically click the edit button here to edit that particular supporter in this case, there is also the option to view. If you're not intending to make any changes, if you know for a fact that you're going into this record simply to look at the data, there are no changes necessary, then view is a better option than edit. The edit option, by default, you would often click on save when you come out, and that will save the fact that you've made a change, even if you haven't made a change within the database. So generally view if you just want to look at the record, edit if you want to change it. So in this particular case, I want to edit the record and say that they are deceased. That's our little pop-up post-it note feature. More on that in another webinar. What are the things that we would want to do to change the record for a deceased supporter? Well, we would very clearly want to change the status here to deceased. When we do that, it'll prompt and ask us whether we want to make some other changes to the record. You should follow those prompts. The things that you won't get prompted to do that you should do as best practice is going along to the personal details here and putting in, if you know it, the date of death. In all likelihood, you won't know that, so you won't know when the supporter was deceased, but you will know when you were notified of this. So it's worth adding in the death notified date, which simply records in the system when you became aware that this supporter was deceased. The other thing to look at against this supporter detail is things like regular giving. So their commitments, it's not a great example because the supporter has lots of them. It's just a demonstration one. But normally you would go into, hopefully there's no more than one ongoing commitment, so regular giving from this supporter. You would go into that record and you would edit it and change the status of that commitment to ceased or completed, depending on the statuses that you record within your system. Why? Because if you're using standing orders or direct debit generation processes within Advantage Fundraiser, it will continue to generate the expected payment for that commitment until either the commitment is complete or cancelled or ceased. So if we know for sure that we're not going to receive any further payments from this supporter or regular gifts from this supporter, then we should be closing the commitment. Likewise with activity involvements, we would want to go down to the activity involvement and look at the activities the supporter is currently involved in, the roles and statuses. So if, for example, this supporter is about to be a volunteer in an event that we're running, we very clearly need to indicate that they're not going to be volunteering at that event, unfortunately. So we will be changing their status against that activity involvement to record the fact that they are no longer involved in the activity. The activity might be a mailing list. We might also want to remove them or cease them within a mailing list. Mailing lists are a little bit more dynamic, so I would recommend for best practice to remove them from the mailing list. The only potential concern with that is it removes the record that indicates they were ever in the mailing list. So ceasing helps us to record the fact that they were at some point in that mailing list. But generally with my mailing list, I keep those as just the current supporters that are receiving the mailing. My activity involvements, I would cease if they were deceased. Whilst we're looking at activities, let's look at activity setups. Again, Jane, if anyone pops their hand up at any time, just let me know. Activity setups, if we go down to reference and activities here, it's a really good idea with activities to use the right activity types to indicate the types of activity that you run as an organization. One of the components of the activity type, and when you create an activity within Advantage, you have to say what activity type it is. That brings across into the creation of an activity, it brings across the business rules for that particular type of activity. And two of the really key business rules are the roles and the status values that those roles can have. So for example, if I have an activity type of mailings, so mail shot I think I'm using, or mailing here, I can have roles that are relevant just for that type of activity. So not a good example here because I put dinner guest in just to show you what you shouldn't be doing. So mail shot target would be a good role for a mail shot, but event attendees and dinner guests shouldn't be under our mail shot activity type. By doing that, what's happening is when I go and create an activity of type mail shot, it pops up and allows me to record dinner guests or event attendees as roles within the mail shot event or mail shot list that I'm creating. And it's not an event, it's a mail shot. So worth understanding which roles and the status values for those roles you want to apply for each activity type. That will then control when you create activities or when you create activity involvements, it will control what information appears available to you when you want to add a supporter to the activity. Likewise with commitments, same sort of thing. With commitments, you should be using different commitment types to record your different types of regular giving or membership that you operate as an organization. And again, you should be thinking about what are the roles or the involvements that can be applicable for this particular commitment. What are the status values that are applicable for this commitment? So Advantage is really flexible. It has the ability for you to define those business rules, and it will then validate the data that you enter into Advantage based on those business rules. So before you create any commitments, before you create any activities, you should look at the reference data, and you should confirm that the reference data for the type of activity you're about to create, or the reference data for the type of commitment you're about to create, are present and set up correctly for what it is you're about to do. All too often we find that customers contact us and say, the creation of an activity or the creation of a commitment doesn't make sense. The screen is offering up values that don't appear correct to us as an organization. And that tells us straight away two things. It tells us that the setup, the configuration in these commitment types and activity types has not been completed properly or hasn't been reviewed recently. It also tells us that there's probably a need for some training or consultancy for those users. That's our activity setup. Opt-in and opt-out. Let's run through that quickly. So if I go back to look at a record, and let's just pop that into the tray. So the tray is our batch function used for sending out mass mailings or mass updates of data. So when I go into the tray and I select that I want to send a communication to a supporter, so I'm just going to pick a standard template there. There are two boxes down here, tick boxes, that are quite important. One talks about non-correspondence and one talks about opt-ins. So Advantage, and in this case, really we're talking about Fundraiser, supports both the ability for you to have legitimate interest mailings, and perhaps all of your mailings are legitimate interest, and also supports the opt-in preference model as well. So the idea of the opt-in preference model is that supporters indicate which of your mailings they would like to receive and how they would like to receive them. The non-correspondence works the other way round. It's when a supporter indicates what they don't want to receive from you. So they don't want to receive information about your raffle, or they don't want to receive information about being a volunteer. The non-correspondence, so this is the I don't want to receive, can be completely under your control. So you can decide what non-correspondence values you want to use. So don't send information about raffle, don't send information about jumble sales or whatever it might be. You can add those non-correspondence types into the system. And you can say for each supporter whether that non-correspondence indicates they shouldn't receive emails or letters, etc., from us. The opt-in is where the supporter indicates what they want to receive. So if in the tray, by standard, you would have those two boxes unticked. If in the tray we start to send this letter and there is no opt-in preference for this channel, for this supporter, then the tray will prevent us sending this mailing. It will say, I don't have an opt-in preference, therefore I can't send this letter to this supporter. However, if we're running legitimate interest, so we're not asking supporters to opt into our mailings, or perhaps this particular mailing is a legitimate interest mailing, so it might be a thank you for a donation, or it might be a reminder of an outstanding payment for membership. Those are both legitimate interests. Then you could tick the ignore opt-in preferences check. And that will say, I don't need to see whether this supporter has specifically opted in for this mailing. I will just check to see whether they have a non-correspondence that means they should not receive this mailing.
Steve, sorry to interrupt. Flora's just asked if that exclude deceased boxes ticks, would they automatically be excluded from mailing?
Yes. Yeah, good question. Yeah, so we don't have deceased supporters by default coming into our mailings. So normally the exclude deceased box is ticked. That stops our deceased records from being selected in mailings. There's one rare occasion where you might want to send something to deceased people, and that is where you're basically sending out an extract of data to somebody like the SME and Ford data service, where they would confirm whether someone is actually indicated as deceased on the mortar screen files. So occasionally we do need to export deceased records, but normally they're excluded. So just to close off on the non-correspondence and the opt-ins, it's basically if you're running an opt-in model, then you would not untick this box, you would leave this blank. By the way, you can set this as the default in the system reference. Then it will ensure that there's an opt-in preference before the supporter is mailed. If you're running legitimate interest, as I'm showing on the screen here, you would leave that box unticked and it would simply look for a non-correspondence. For those of you that are wondering why we have the ability to also tick ignore non-correspondence check, that is where you have already carried out your due diligence. You know that the supporters in the trade definitely want to receive this mailing, and you can tell the system to ignore that non-correspondence check. Hey, I'm going to try and move really quickly through some of these other ones. Tax years. So when you do a gift aid claim within Advantage Fundraiser, you need to make sure that the tax year for the period of gifts that you are trying to reclaim the gift aid on is set up correctly. It's worth checking this. I mean, obviously once a year at the very least, but you might want to check it from time to time. And that is just making sure that you have a tax year created. I don't have a current tax year for 2023 set up here. So let's just go and put that in. What that means is if I try to do a gift aid claim right now for any donation that had been received after the 5th of April 2022, then the gift aid process would not work properly. It would prompt me and tell me that it was not set up correctly. So in order to do that, I need to put my year in. So 2023. Oh dear. Right. Yeah. 2023, I need to give it a start date, so the 6th of April 2, and that would run to the 5th of April 23. And our current tax bands are 0 for the lower rate, 10 and 20, and I think our gift aid small donation limit is still 8,000. So you would then set up your year with those correct details like that. Okay, tasks. So I'm running the task manager here currently. So the task manager is a list of tasks that are set up and added into Advantage Fundraiser and linked to a particular, well, typically to a supporter, but they could be linked to an activity, so an event task. They could be linked to a commitment, a regular gift that says check that we've received the payment, check it's not in arrears, and so on. So tasks can be attached to different parts of the Advantage database. But one thing they're always or should always be attached to is a staff member that needs to do the task work. So when we go to create a task, if we're looking at our supporter record here, for example, and we're into tasks and new, one of the things that we do is we can assign that to a member of staff or assign it to a unit. So a question we often get from new users calling up is, I can't put tasks against myself, or tasks can't be assigned to me. That simply means that the member of staff has not been set up within Advantage Fundraiser or Advantage CRM. So it's looking for a staff identifier here. The little ellipsis button allows me to go in and choose the staff member. But if you have the authority to do so, you have the ability to create a new staff member here. You would click on new, put in staff ID, so employee number or surname and first initial, whatever your staff identifiers are, the type of staff that they are with the drop-down list. So whoever they are, whether they're permanent, temporary or volunteer, that's a drop-down list, so that's under your control. The date they started for the organisation, and then link them to the person record, which gives us information about their name and address and mobile or work number and so on, so their contact information. Once you create that record, it then appear in the list and you can assign your task to that member of staff. Editing contact details. So if I go in and edit a supporter within the system, one of the things that you might be tempted to do, and we see it quite a lot, is change the address here. So this supporter has moved from 115 Litchfield Grove in London to a different address. So I start typing over the address at this point. That's not the best practice. The best practice is to cease the address, so this existing address, and then when you cease the address, you can then type in underneath it the new address for that supporter. Why do we do that? Basically, so we've got the history that tells us they used to live at this address until this particular date, when they then moved to the new address, the second address we have in the system. That allows us then to search for them by searching against their previous address as well as their current address. It means that one of our members of staff coming in doesn't think, oh, I know Steve doesn't live in Redbourne, he lives in London, must have made a mistake, and overtypes it again. You actually see that history of when the change was made. The same approach should be taken for things like telephone numbers and email addresses as well. You'll notice for each of them there is a cease date. For postal addresses, telephone numbers, and email addresses, there is always one value that is indicated as the primary. That's the one that by default your mailings or your emails, in the case of an email, go to. So if you cease this email address, there will no longer be a primary address. When you enter in the new email address for the supporter, that will automatically tick as the primary. So it recognizes the fact you put in a new valid email or a valid postal address and creates that as the primary address. So best practice, don't overtype, cease the records or cease the data that's already there and enter the new information into the appropriate box on the screen. Just while we talk about contact information, there's a separate webinar on data cleaning, but just to touch on that very briefly. So personal data, so name and address information, deceased information, gone away information, etc., decays roughly at about 18% a year. So that means that if you have 100 records in your supporter database, 18 of them a year later will have some bit of that information out of date. So it's good practice to run a regular data clean, checking the data within your database against all the different screening files, the gone away suppression file, the mortality screening file, the post office address file, because postcodes change. So Redbourne, for example, might be a locality within St Albans. It might become a separate post town, and therefore you don't need to put St Albans in the address anymore. So those changes happen very frequently, and regular data cleaning is the way that you keep on top of that 18% change. If you're thinking about business addresses, so corporate records, they decay even faster. So various reports, but between sort of 25 and 30% a year, business data decays. So if you haven't cleaned your data for the last 5 years, for example, could be getting close to half the data within your database might be inaccurate. That means that you might be sending mailings to completely the wrong addresses for supporters. You might be sending mailings to deceased individuals and so on. So best practice, regular data cleaning. A couple of quickies, filtering. So when you create a new filter within the system and you save your filter, so filters is how you search for records within the database. Little top tip, when you click on the save filter here, once you've actually created a filter in, you can click on save. A nice thing to do is to name your filters with your initials. So when everybody looks at that filter and wants to know who created it and why did they set up the filter in that particular way, then they know the initials of the person who did it and therefore who to ask. So we generally recommend that. Advantage can be set up to remember the filters that you use most frequently, and it can learn that either as an organization or it can learn that as an individual. So in other words, the filters that I run regularly might be my ranked order in my screen. Jane might see a different order because we've told Advantage to look individually, or we can say we want to track the filter usage across the whole organization, and it'll keep shuffling up the filters that are used most frequently by anybody in the organization up to the top of the list of predefined filters. That's this list that we're talking about here, or the list that you see when you click here. I'll just touch on that really briefly and just say that Advantage now supports a password policy. By the way, multi-factor authentication is also coming in the next release, so two-factor authentication. But the password policy allows you to say that users must change their password on a regular basis within Advantage Fundraiser, particularly CRM as well, and also the rules around the password complexity. So it must be a minimum length of whatever characters you say. It must have the minimum complexity of special characters or a mix of uppercase characters and so on. That's a system configuration on the system reference within Advantage Fundraiser, that password policy, and also Advantage CRM. Remote link, just quickly on that one. Those of you that are using the public cloud version of Advantage Fundraiser, when you're not in the office, so you're working from home or internet cafe or wherever you are, clicking on the use remote link ensures that you have a secure end-to-end encrypted VPN connection between you and the data that's stored in the public cloud data center, which is Microsoft South or Microsoft West. The importance of that when you're outside of the organization is that it keeps your data secure. However, when you're working in your office and you're connected to your local area network, you will see a faster connection if you untick the use remote link. The remote link option is there for when you are remote to the office, and if you're in the office, untick the use remote link. Just remember to tick it back on again once you're outside of the office again. And then little topic, because I know we're slightly over time. Third-party plugins. So just to talk briefly about the fact that I mentioned about communications. Our communications within Advantage Fundraiser, if they are emails that are being sent outside of Advantage Fundraiser or Advantage CRM, our Outlook add-in module allows you to log those emails within Advantage, either sent or received emails, without you having to go into Advantage and record it. Within Outlook, you have the ability to click on a Log in Advantage button, and that will log that email for you. And it'll create the communication and take a copy of the email from your Outlook or Exchange or Office 365 mailbox, and it will drop that copy into the Advantage data. We've mentioned PAF already. There are integrations within Advantage for looking up addresses as you type them into the system, so it automatically checks that the address is current. We're also working for next year on the feature for it to check address data and also things like the mortality screening as you enter or update the record. But PAF is a great post office address file, is a good way of checking that your data is accurate. For those of you that are using MailChimp or any of our email service providers, MailChimp, we have an integration. So if you're using MailChimp and Advantage together and you don't have our MailChimp integration, the MailChimp integration module, it's a cost module, but that will give you the ability to synchronize your MailChimp mailing list and your Advantage mailing list together. Jane uses that for all of our mailing lists, for example, for our Advantage systems. And the last best practice, talking about documents within the system, we store links to documents within Advantage CRM and Advantage Fundraiser. Those links to documents that you've stored, those stored documents can be in SharePoint or on-premise. I think quite a few customers have talked to us about where do we store documents. Our best practice advice now is SharePoint, so using cloud storage to store those documents. So it's obviously available wherever you need it, as long as you've got internet connectivity. And the documents within Advantage is simply linking to where they are stored on the SharePoint site. Those are the topics I wanted to cover. I said it was going to be pretty quick. It's a rapid run through. I'll stop presenting and just see whether there are any questions on what was probably a lot of information in a very short space of time. But remember, you can go back and replay the webinar again. But any questions for anyone? Emily, yes. Hi.
Hi, Steve. Can you elaborate a bit more about PAF? I didn't quite get it, please.
Sure. So it's a third-party plugin, Emily. So it's a cost option, but we use a product we recommend from a company called AFD. You can buy that through us, but if you want to know more about it, afd.co.uk. And what that does is, as you type in address information, it verifies the address information you've entered. Very similar to when you're on the phone to like your car insurance or whatever, and they say, what's your postcode and your house number? You can take that information, it automatically completes the rest of the address. If over the phone somebody said that their address included Redbourne and you put the E on the end of that, the product will automatically correct and remove that superfluous E from the end of Redbourne, for example. So it's validating and checking the address data.
And is that a one-off cost or is it an annual cost?
It's an annual cost. There are two choices. Either you buy lookups in the cloud, which basically means that you don't need any installation. Advantage just talks to a cloud service and brings that data back to Advantage, or you can have it on premise where every quarter you download the latest version of the post office address file. We do all that with you through the support, but it's a little bit more onerous if you have it on premise, because you've got to remember to keep it updated. The cloud is updated multiple times a day. So
yeah, so well, it's preferable to do the cloud. The cloud is much easier, straightforward.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think we a few years ago we used your data cleansing and updates. But as you said, it's good to do that on a regular basis. Yeah. Thank you.
Right. Good question. Thanks, Emily. Any other questions? Does anybody, I know we're over time, but if anyone thinks of any other best practice ideas that they would like to share? Of course, nobody likes to be put on the spot. So. Okay, so if you do, let us know, because one of the things we're always looking to try and do in our newsletter, which Jane prepares for us every month, is to have top tips. So if you have a top tip you want to share, please do send that through with Jane, and we make sure we share that across the audience. Also, by the way, Jane is still maintaining her spotlight feature. So that's an opportunity for us to really spotlight one of our customers and say, this is what the customer is working on currently. So a project. Emily is one of the customers working with Shari Zedek. And one of the things I think we did recently, Jane, wasn't it, was a talk about Shari Zedek within the newsletter. So we're always looking for customer stories that we can include within the newsletter. And so if you have that content, share that with Jane as well, and you get to feature in the next newsletter.
The next
Last-
webinar, which you might
I was
want to
about
know.
to ask that, Jane. Good.
I've actually prepared this time. On the 20th of July, we will be covering direct debits and standing orders.
Great. Thanks, Jane. So if you want to know more about direct debits and standing orders, do join us in July for that webinar. We're also looking for ideas. I know, actually, Jane, we've got quite a long list now, haven't we? But we're always looking for ideas for webinars. So if there's a topic you want us to cover in a webinar, then again, please let Jane know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Other than that, I think just want to say thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. Apologies we went over a little bit, but I did really want to try and cover as many of those things as we could in the time we have available. Don't forget to go back and